The salt water burned Lieutenant Takeshi Nakamura's eyes as he gasped for air, bobbing in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. His Zero fighter, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, now nothing but scattered debris around him. Blood streamed from his shoulder, turning the ocean water crimson. This is the honorable death I was promised, he thought, watching American warships approach through blurred vision. Takeshi's trembling hand reached for the tanto knife strapped to his flight suit. His commander's words hammered in his mind. Capture means you have failed the Emperor. Your family will bear your shame for generations. Take your life or die trying to take theirs. He had been raised on stories of what American barbarians did to captured Japanese pilots. Torture, humiliation, medical experiments. Every fiber of his training told him to plunge the blade into his stomach rather than face what was coming. But something stopped him. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was that primal instinct to survive. Or maybe it was simple curiosity. What if everything he'd been taught was a lie? The American destroyer was less than 50 yards away now. Sailors lined the railings, pointing at him. Takeshi closed his eyes, certain these were his final moments alive. He whispered a prayer to his ancestors, apologizing for the dishonor of being captured. What happened next would shatter everything he believed about his enemy, and change how he understood humanity itself. It was 1944 in the bloody Pacific Theater, where two nations fought with a savagery that shocked the world. Japanese military doctrine was absolute. Surrender meant disgrace worse than death. Every soldier, sailor, and pilot was prepared to die rather than be captured. Many carried grenades not to kill the enemy, but to take their own lives if faced with defeat. The code of Bushido, the ancient warrior's path, had been transformed into a death cult. Japanese propaganda painted Americans as monsters who tortured prisoners for sport. Military training made one thing clear: better to sink beneath the waves or crash your plane into an enemy ship than suffer the fate that awaited you in American hands. This wasn't just rhetoric. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces chose suicide over surrender at rates that horrified even hardened war correspondents. At Saipan, civilians jumped from cliffs rather than be captured. Pilots deliberately crashed their planes when damaged. This was the world Lieutenant Nakamura had been raised in. But as the American sailors threw him a life preserver instead of opening fire, Takeshi was about to discover a truth so shocking it would make him question everything he'd ever been taught. If you've ever wondered about the moment when sworn enemies look into each other's eyes and see a human being instead of a monster, this story will change how you understand humanity in war. The extraordinary truth of what happened when Japanese pilots were pulled from the Pacific by the very men they'd been trying to kill moments before reveals something profound about who we really are beneath the uniforms we wear. Hit that like button and keep watching, because what these pilots discovered will leave you speechless. World War II erupted across the globe in the late 1930s, but America stayed out of the fighting at first. That all changed on December 7th, 1941, a day President Roosevelt said would live in infamy. Japanese planes swooped down on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, attacking American ships without warning. Over 2,400 Americans died that morning, and the mighty U.S. Pacific Fleet lay damaged and burning. The surprise attack shocked and enraged Americans. The very next day, the United States declared war on Japan. What followed was one of the biggest and bloodiest wars ever fought across the vast Pacific Ocean. But to understand what made Japanese pilots so afraid of being captured, we need to look at how different these two countries were, not just as enemies, but in how they thought about war itself. In Japan, during the 1930s and 1940s, the military controlled almost everything. Japanese children grew up learning that their emperor was divine, a living god, and that dying for him was the highest honor possible. Schools taught that Japan was destined to rule Asia and that Western countries like America were trying to stop Japan's rightful place in the world. Japanese military training was incredibly harsh. Soldiers were beaten for the smallest mistakes. Officers could strike their men without consequence. This brutal training had a purpose: to create warriors who would never question orders and would rather die than surrender. At the heart of this mindset was an ancient warrior code called Bushido. For centuries, Japan's samurai had lived by this code, which valued loyalty, bravery, and honor above all else. But during the war years, military leaders twisted Bushido into something extreme. They taught that surrender brought eternal shame not just to the soldier, but to his entire family. 7 lives for the emperor became a common saying. It meant every Japanese soldier should be willing to die 7 times over if it would serve Japan. Pilots wrote death poems before missions. Mothers gave their sons daggers with instructions to use them on themselves rather than face capture. What made this mindset even stronger were the terrifying stories spread throughout the Japanese military about American brutality. Military instructors told graphic tales about what would happen if you were captured alive. Americans collect Japanese ears as trophies, officers warned. They will torture you for information, then execute you slowly. They perform medical experiments on living prisoners. They will display you in cages like animals for American civilians to mock. These weren't just rumors, they were official military teachings. Pictures and pamphlets showed Americans as devils with horns or as savage apes. One widely circulated military manual stated, "The Americans are beasts. They are not human. A quick death is too good for them, and capture by them is worse than any death." Soldiers were told that if captured, their families back home would be forever marked with shame. Their names would be erased from family records. No one would pray for their spirits. In Japanese culture, where family honor and ancestor worship were sacred, this was a fate worse than death. The reality of American rescue operations told a completely different story. When American ships or planes spotted enemy survivors in the water, whether they were Japanese, German, or Italian, standard procedure was to rescue them if possible. The U.S. Navy and Air Force had dedicated rescue teams whose entire job was finding and saving downed airmen and sailors, regardless of which side they fought for. American military doctors treated enemy wounded with the same care given to their own soldiers. According to the Geneva Convention, international rules about how to treat prisoners of war, captured soldiers had rights that had to be respected. While not every American followed these rules perfectly, official U.S. military policy was to treat prisoners humanely. Special prisoner of war camps were set up far from the fighting, where captured Japanese would be safe until the war ended. They received regular meals, medical care, and were even allowed to write letters home, though these often never reached Japan because Japanese authorities refused to accept them. Most surprisingly to the Japanese, Americans didn't view surrender as dishonorable. In American military culture, becoming a prisoner was unfortunate but not shameful. What mattered was that you fought bravely before being captured and that you tried to escape if possible. This fundamental cultural difference meant American and Japanese soldiers approached the possibility of capture with completely different mindsets. But here's what makes this story so remarkable. When Japanese pilots were pulled from the sea by American sailors, they expected immediate execution or torture. What these pilots were about to discover would shake everything they believed about their enemy. Dawn broke over the Pacific Ocean on July 15, 1944. The sky turned from black to deep purple to fiery orange as the sun peeked over the horizon. For Lieutenant Takeshi Nakamura and his wingman, Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto, this sunrise might be their last. They were part of a special attack squadron. 16 Zero fighters sent to intercept American bombers heading toward Japanese-held islands. Their mission was simple: stop the Americans at all costs. Takeshi checked his instruments one more time and tightened the white headband beneath his flight helmet. The cloth bore the rising sun symbol and the words "certain victory." His stomach knotted with a mixture of pride and fear. At 23, he had already survived longer than many of his fellow pilots. "Enemy aircraft spotted," crackled the squadron leader's voice through the radio. 3 o'clock high. American Hellcats escorting bombers, prepare to engage. Takeshi looked right and upward. There they were, silver specks against the blue sky, growing larger by the second. American Hellcat fighters protecting a group of B-24 bombers. The Hellcats were newer, faster, and better armored than the Japanese Zeros, but the Zero could turn tighter. That was their only advantage. "For the Emperor!" shouted the squadron leader as the Japanese planes climbed toward the Americans. The peaceful morning exploded into chaos, the sky filled with the roar of engines, the rattle of machine guns, and the whistle of planes diving and climbing. Thick white contrails crisscrossed the blue like angry chalk marks. Black smoke puffed where bullets hit metal. Takeshi pushed his stick forward and dived toward one of the bombers, his finger on the trigger. His Zero shuddered as he fired at the massive American plane. He saw his bullet strike the bomber's wing, but the giant aircraft kept flying, hardly damaged by his attack. A shadow passed overhead. Takeshi looked up just in time to see an American Hellcat swooping down on him. The enemy pilot had caught him focused on the bomber. A rookie mistake. "Behind you, Lieutenant," Kenji shouted through the radio. Takeshi yanked his stick to the left, throwing his Zero into a tight turn. But he was too late. The Americans' guns flashed. Bullets tore through Takeshi's right wing. One round punched through the cockpit, grazing his shoulder. Hot pain shot down his arm. His plane shuddered violently. Black smoke poured from the engine. Warning lights flashed across his instrument panel. The Zero was going down. "Yamamoto, I'm hit," Takeshi called to his wingman. "Avenge me." He fought to control his damaged aircraft, but the Zero wouldn't respond. The nose dipped toward the ocean far below. The blue water rushed up to meet him with terrifying speed. Takeshi had seen other pilots crash into the sea. Few survived, and those who did often chose to drown themselves rather than face capture. That's what he had been taught to do. That's what honor demanded. At the last second, he pulled back on the stick with all his strength. The Zero's nose lifted slightly, but not enough. He hit the water at a shallow angle, the impact slamming him forward against his harness. His head struck the instrument panel. For a moment, everything went black. Cold water shocked him back to consciousness. The cockpit was filling fast. The Zero was sinking nose first into the Pacific. Takeshi fumbled with his harness buckle, his fingers slippery with blood from his wounded shoulder. The water was already up to his chest, rising fast. The buckle finally gave way. Takeshi took a deep breath and pushed himself out of the cockpit just as the water covered his head. He kicked away from the sinking plane, his lungs burning as he swam upward toward the light. His flight suit and boots dragged him down, but survival instinct pushed him upward. He broke the surface with a desperate gasp, gulping air into his starving lungs. The salt water stung his wounded shoulder. Around him floated pieces of his Zero, a section of wing, his shattered canopy, an oil slick spreading across the water like a dark stain. Looking up, Takeshi could still see the battle raging above. Tiny specks circled and dived, occasionally erupting in flames when a plane was hit. He couldn't tell who was winning. It didn't matter now. For him, the war was over one way or another. As the adrenaline faded, pain and exhaustion took over. Takeshi managed to grab a floating piece of his wing to help stay afloat. His mind raced with dark thoughts. "I have failed," he thought. "I should end it now, while I still have the strength." His hand moved to the knife at his belt. In training, they had been very clear. Capture meant shame. Shame for him, shame for his family. Better to die by his own hand than suffer what the Americans would do to him. But something held him back. Maybe it was the simple human desire to live. Maybe it was doubt about the stories he'd been told. Or maybe it was just that dying was harder than he had imagined. The sun beat down mercilessly as hours passed. Thirst tortured him. His wounded shoulder throbbed. Takeshi drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes hallucinating that he was home in Japan, walking through cherry blossoms with his mother and sister. Then he saw it. A shape on the horizon. At first, he thought it was another hallucination, but as it grew larger, he recognized the unmistakable silhouette of an American destroyer. Fear coursed through him, stronger than the pain of his wounds. This was the moment of truth. Everything he had been taught told him to take his knife and plunge it into his stomach or let himself sink beneath the waves. Better to die with honor than live with shame, his instructor had repeated countless times. The American ship grew larger. Now Takeshi could see tiny figures on deck, pointing in his direction. They had spotted him. His hand trembled on his knife handle. In his mind, he saw his mother receiving news of his honorable death. He imagined his name on the family shrine, his spirit joining his ancestors. But another thought intruded. What if? What if the stories weren't true? What if there was a chance to see his family again someday? The American ship was close now, less than half a mile away. There was little time left to decide. Takeshi's fingers loosened on his knife. Something deep inside him, something more powerful than his training, more basic than his indoctrination, wanted to live. With a deep breath, he raised his uninjured arm and waved it weakly above the water. The American destroyer turned directly toward him. What happened next would either confirm his worst fears or change everything he believed. Aboard the USS Mitchell, an American destroyer patrolling the Pacific, radio man first class. Robert Wilson lowered his binoculars and called to the officer on deck. "Sir, man in the water. 2 o'clock. Looks like a downed pilot." Lieutenant Commander James Harris rushed to the railing, squinting against the glare of the midday sun. About half a mile away, something dark bobbed among the waves. "Could be debris," Harris said, raising his own binoculars. Then he saw an arm wave weakly. "No, that's definitely a survivor, and that looks like a piece of Japanese Zero floating next to him." Harris didn't hesitate. "Prepare for rescue operation. Full stop. Lower the whaleboat. I want our medic ready." The American sailors moved with practiced efficiency. The giant ship slowed its engines, changing course to create a calmer area of water. Crewmen rushed to lower one of the small rescue boats that hung from davits on the side of the destroyer. 4 sailors, including a medic named Charlie Martinez, climbed aboard the small craft as it was lowered to the water. "Remember," Harris called down to them, "we treat enemy wounded the same as our own." As the rescue boat approached him, Takeshi Nakamura fought a war inside his own mind. Everything he had been taught told him these Americans were about to torture and kill him. The honorable thing was to drown himself before they arrived. Yet his body refused to sink beneath the waves. The American boat drew closer. Takeshi could see the faces of the sailors now. They didn't look like the demons from Japanese propaganda posters. They looked like ordinary men, young, just like him. Some even looked concerned. The boat pulled alongside him. 2 sailors leaned over the side, reaching for him with extended arms. Takeshi flinched away, certain they were about to strike him or drag him to his doom. "It's okay, buddy," one of them said in English. "We've got you." Not understanding the words, but surprised by the gentle tone, Takeshi remained frozen. The Americans didn't wait for permission. Strong hands grabbed him under his arms, lifting him from the water with surprising gentleness. Pain shot through his wounded shoulder as they pulled him into the boat. He cried out, then immediately regretted showing weakness in front of the enemy. To his shock, the American wearing a medic's armband immediately began examining his wounded shoulder. Instead of causing more pain, the medic's hands were careful, professional. He pressed a clean white bandage against the wound. "You're lucky," the medic said, pointing to the wound and giving a thumbs-up sign to indicate it wasn't serious. "Through and through. Clean exit wound." Takeshi stared at him, uncomprehending. Why were they treating his injury? Were they making sure he stayed alive for interrogation? For torture. As the small boat returned to the destroyer, Takeshi trembled, partly from cold, partly from fear. He kept waiting for the Americans to show their true nature, to become the monsters he had been warned about. Instead, they wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and offered him a canteen of water. The small boat reached the side of the destroyer. A harness was lowered. The Americans motioned for Takeshi to put his arms and head through it. He hesitated, thinking it might be some kind of torture device. But when one of the sailors demonstrated by partially putting it on himself, Takeshi understood it was to lift him safely to the deck. Once aboard the USS Mitchell, Takeshi found himself surrounded by curious American sailors. Their faces showed no hatred, only interest and perhaps a bit of caution. An officer stepped forward, Lieutenant Commander Harris. "Welcome aboard," Harris said slowly, knowing the Japanese pilot probably wouldn't understand. Takeshi stood rigid, waiting for the beatings to begin. He had been taught to expect the worst, to be paraded around the deck as a trophy, beaten, tortured for information, then killed slowly for the Americans' amusement. Instead, Harris pointed to himself. "Harris," he said, then pointed questioningly at Takeshi. After a moment's hesitation, Takeshi responded, "Nakamura." A simple exchange of names, it seemed so ordinary, so human. Not what Takeshi had expected at all. Harris nodded to the ship's doctor, who stepped forward to check Takeshi's wound more thoroughly. The Japanese pilot flinched again when the doctor approached, but the man's gentle manner quickly made it clear he was there to help, not harm. "Let's get him below to sick bay," the doctor said. "He needs that shoulder properly cleaned and bandaged, and some dry clothes and hot food. As two sailors carefully guided Takeshi toward a hatch leading below decks, he noticed something that stunned him even more than the Americans' unexpected kindness. In the distance, another American rescue boat was approaching a second Japanese pilot floating in the water. His wingman, Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto. Takeshi watched in disbelief as the Americans pulled his friend from the sea with the same care they had shown him. Kenji's face revealed the same mixture of terror, confusion, and dawning wonder that Takeshi himself felt. When Kenji was brought aboard, the two Japanese pilots locked eyes across the deck. A silent message passed between them. This is not what we were told would happen. As Takeshi was led below decks, his mind raced with questions. Why were these Americans treating them like humans instead of animals? Where was the cruelty they had been warned about? Was this all an elaborate trick before the real horror began? The sick bay was small but clean. The doctor worked on Takeshi's shoulder while explaining what he was doing through simple gestures. A sailor brought dry clothes, American clothes, and a steaming mug of something that smelled sweet. When Kenji joined him in the sick bay, minutes later, the two Japanese pilots sat side by side, sipping hot cocoa, something neither had tasted before, wrapped in American blankets, trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly turned upside down. Can you imagine what was going through these pilots' minds? In the span of a few hours, they went from trying to kill Americans to being rescued, treated medically, and given hot chocolate by those same Americans. Comment below what you would have felt in that moment. Would you have trusted your rescuers, or would you have remained suspicious that something terrible was still coming? The sick bay of the USS Mitchell was nothing like what Takeshi and Kenji had imagined an American warship would be. Instead of a torture chamber, it was a clean, organized medical area with 6 beds, medical equipment, and the smell of antiseptic. The ship's doctor, Lieutenant William Parker, carefully cleaned Takeshi's shoulder wound, while a medic attended to Kenji's less serious injuries. "This might sting a bit," Dr. Parker said, applying disinfectant to Takeshi's wound. Though Takeshi didn't understand the words, the doctor's gentle warning tone and careful movements conveyed his meaning. The Japanese pilot winced but remained still, watching with fascination as the American doctor treated an enemy with the same care he would give his own men. After bandaging Takeshi's shoulder, Dr. Parker stepped back and smiled. He pointed to his work and gave a thumbs up, then handed Takeshi 2 white pills and a cup of water. Takeshi stared at the pills suspiciously. Were they poison? Truth serum? Some kind of American trick? Noticing his hesitation, Dr. Parker took a similar pill from a bottle, put it in his own mouth, and swallowed it with water. Then he pointed to Takeshi's shoulder and made a face suggesting pain, followed by a relaxed expression, mimicking relief. "Pain medicine," he said slowly, "for pain." This simple act, the doctor taking medicine himself to show it was safe, struck Takeshi deeply. It was a gesture of trust, of shared humanity. After a moment's hesitation, he swallowed the pills. Once their medical treatment was complete, Takeshi and Kenji were given fresh clothes, American Navy uniforms with the insignia removed, and led to a small compartment with 2 bunks, a small table, and a chair. It wasn't luxurious, but it wasn't a prison cell either. There was even a small porthole window showing the ocean outside. "You'll stay here," explained Lieutenant Harris through gestures. "Food soon." When the door closed behind them, Kenji turned to Takeshi, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Lieutenant, why are they treating us this way?" he whispered in Japanese. "Where are the beatings? The torture? Everything we were told?" "I don't know," Takeshi admitted. "Perhaps they are waiting until we reach their main base, or maybe they want to gain our trust before they start questioning us." But deep down, Takeshi was beginning to doubt the stories they had been told. Nothing about this experience matched what his training had prepared him for. An hour later, a young sailor arrived with 2 trays of food. The meal was simple, some kind of meat stew, bread, and canned fruit, but it was the same food the American sailors were eating, not scraps or rotten leftovers as they had been told prisoners would receive. The sailor noticed Kenji examining the food suspiciously. With a friendly smile, he took a spoonful from each of their trays and ate it, then patted his stomach appreciatively. "Good," he said. "Eat. Good." After he left, Takeshi and Kenji ate hungrily, realizing how long it had been since their pre-mission meal. The stew was different from Japanese food, but satisfying. Maybe they're fattening us up, Kenji suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. The next morning brought more surprises. Their door wasn't locked. They were restricted to certain areas of the ship, but not confined to their room. A young officer who knew a few words of Japanese was assigned to them as an interpreter. His name was Ensign Robert Miller, and he had studied Japanese language and culture at university before the war. "You safe here," Miller struggled to say in broken Japanese. "No harm." Throughout that day, the Japanese pilots witnessed things that contradicted everything they had been taught. A sailor offered them cigarettes, lighting one for himself and sharing the match. The ship's barber gave them haircuts, chatting amiably despite the language barrier. When Takeshi accidentally bumped into a large American sailor in a narrow passageway, instead of the expected violent response, the man simply steadied him with a hand on his good shoulder and continued on his way. During a meal in the ship's mess hall, several curious American sailors invited them to sit at their table. Using a mixture of simple English, Miller's basic Japanese, and many hand gestures, they attempted conversation. One sailor showed Takeshi pictures of his wife and children back in California. Another demonstrated a card trick. Most shocking of all, when an air raid siren sounded and everyone rushed to battle stations, Takeshi and Kenji weren't locked away. Instead, they were guided to a safe area by a young sailor who seemed more concerned with their welfare than the possibility they might try to sabotage the ship. That evening, as they sat in their compartment trying to make sense of their experience, Takeshi finally voiced what they were both thinking. "What if everything we were told about Americans was a lie?" he whispered. Kenji looked troubled. "But if that's true, what else have we been told that isn't true?" Their conversation was interrupted by Ensign Miller, who entered with a worn Japanese-English dictionary and something tucked under his arm. "Captain wants talk you," he said in halting Japanese. Then he placed what he was carrying on the table, 2 writing pads and pencils. "Write family," Miller said, miming writing a letter. "We send Red Cross." Takeshi and Kenji stared at the paper in disbelief. They were being allowed to write to their families, to let them know they were alive. In Japan, they had been taught that captured soldiers were considered dead, their names removed from family registries. No one at home would be looking for word from them. Yet here were these Americans, offering to help them contact their families. As this realization sank in, Miller added something else. He pulled out a small book with a red cross on the cover, a copy of the Geneva Convention, Rules on Treatment of Prisoners of War, with Japanese translation. "This, how we treat prisoners," Miller said, tapping the book. "Law. What happened next would completely change how these men saw the world." 2 weeks passed aboard the USS Mitchell. With each day, Takeshi and Kenji found their certainties crumbling. The monsters they had been trained to fear and hate revealed themselves to be ordinary men with families, dreams, and kindness. One evening, sitting on the deck watching the sunset, Takeshi turned to his wingman. "I was ready to die for the Emperor," he said quietly in Japanese. "I believe that was the only honorable path." Kenji nodded, his eyes on the horizon where the sun melted into the sea. "Now I wonder, how many other things we were told that weren't true? The transformation happening inside these Japanese pilots wasn't simple or easy. For years, their military training had shaped not just what they thought, but who they were. Now, everything was being questioned. They had been told, Americans will torture you for information. Instead, they were given medical care and treated with respect. They had been told, Americans see Japanese as animals, not humans. Instead, American sailors shared pictures of their families and taught them card games. They had been told, capture means eternal shame for your family. Instead, they were encouraged to write letters home through the Red Cross. They had been told, better to die than live as a prisoner. Instead, they discovered that living allowed them to see truth with their own eyes. This last point caused the deepest struggle. Both pilots had pledged to die rather than be captured. They had watched friends crash their damaged planes into American ships rather than bail out. They had saluted pilots who took off on suicide missions, never to return. Have we betrayed them by living? Kenji asked one night, his voice barely audible over the sound of waves against the ship's hull. Takeshi had no answer. The American captain seemed to understand their internal struggle. Through Ensign Miller's improving Japanese, he arranged for them to meet 3 other Japanese pilots who had been rescued months earlier and were now helping translate Japanese documents. The meeting took place in the officers' mess. The 3 former Imperial pilots wore clean American clothes. They looked healthy, calm, almost at peace, something Takeshi hadn't expected. The oldest of them, a former squadron commander named Hiroshi Tanaka, spoke first. "I know what you're feeling," he said in Japanese. "The shame, the confusion. I tried to kill myself twice after they rescued me." He rolled up his sleeve, showing a long scar on his wrist. "I believed everything they told us in training, but then I saw American doctors save the life of a Japanese pilot who was badly burned. They worked all night. Why would they do that for an enemy they planned to torture?" Another pilot named Matsuo showed them letters he had received from his family through the Red Cross. "My parents thought I was dead," he said. "When they got my letter, they held a celebration. My mother wrote that her son had returned from the spirit world." Takeshi read the letter, his hands trembling. The simple joy of Matsuo's mother leapt off the page. There was no shame in her words, only gratitude that her son lived. "But what about honor?" Kenji asked. "We were supposed to die for the Emperor." The third pilot, Ito, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "I asked myself that question every day for months. Then I realized something. We can serve Japan better by living than by dying." "How?" Takeshi demanded. "By seeing the truth, by knowing our enemy as they really are, not as we were told. Someday, this war will end. Someone will need to build peace. How can that happen if we all die believing lies?" As Takeshi and Kenji reflected on these words, they were startled by an unexpected visitor. The American sailor whose life Takeshi had tried to take during the air battle, the Hellcat pilot who had shot him down, was transferred to the USS Mitchell. Lieutenant James Cooper entered the mess hall, instantly recognizing Takeshi from an intelligence photos of the downed Zero. Through Ensign Miller, he asked to speak with Takeshi privately. Takeshi's heart raced as he followed Cooper to a quiet corner. Was this finally the moment when American cruelty would reveal itself? Cooper pulled out a photograph of his family back in Nebraska. Through Miller, he explained that he had a brother fighting in Europe and a sister working as a nurse in Hawaii. "I wanted to see the face of the man I almost killed," Cooper said, "not as an enemy pilot, but as a person." He extended his hand to Takeshi, a simple gesture that asked a profound question. Can we see each other as men, not just enemies? After a moment's hesitation, Takeshi grasped Cooper's hand. In that handshake, between 2 men who had tried to kill each other just weeks before, both found something unexpected: recognition of shared humanity. Later that night, Takeshi wrote in a journal provided by Dr. Soksando Parker, "Today, I realize a truth more powerful than any I have known before. The dividing lines between us and them, between enemy and friend, are drawn by men, not gods. They can be crossed, they can even be erased. If I had died as my training demanded, I would never have learned this. Perhaps living was not the coward's choice after all, but the braver one." When World War II finally ended in August 1945, more than 50,000 Japanese military personnel were in American custody as prisoners of war. Among them were Takeshi, Kenji, and hundreds of other pilots who had been rescued from the sea by the very men they had once sworn to destroy. The journey home wasn't simple. Many Japanese prisoners feared returning to a country that had taught them capture was shameful. But when Takeshi finally stepped off the transport ship in Tokyo Harbor in early 1946, he found a Japan transformed. The emperor had renounced his divine status. The military government that had led them to war was gone, and families welcomed back their dead sons with tears of joy rather than shame. Takeshi Nakamura returned to his family home in Osaka to discover his mother had kept his photo on their family altar, praying daily for his spirit. When he appeared at her door, very much alive, she fainted from shock. Later, she told him, "The gods have sent you back to us." But Takeshi knew it wasn't gods who had saved him. It was former enemies who chose compassion over hatred. Many rescued Japanese pilots struggled to fit back into a defeated Japan. Some faced suspicion from neighbors who had lost sons in the war. Why did you survive when my boy died? Grieving parents would ask. It was a question that haunted them, yet many found purpose in their unique experience. Kenji Yamamoto became a teacher, dedicated to helping the next generation understand the dangers of blind nationalism. I teach my students to question what they were told, he wrote in his memoir, to see people as people first, not as labels created by governments. Takeshi worked as a translator for the American occupation forces, then later joined efforts to rebuild diplomatic ties between Japan and America. In 1960, he hosted Lieutenant James Cooper, the pilot who had shot him down and later shook his hand, when Cooper visited Japan with his family. The photograph of these former enemies standing together with their families, smiling outside Takeshi's home, traveled around the world. For many, it became a powerful symbol of reconciliation after humanity's bloodiest conflict. Not every story ended so perfectly. Some rescued pilots never overcame their shame. Others resented their American captors despite the humane treatment they received. Healing from war is never simple or complete, but the experiences of these Japanese pilots reveal something profound about human nature. When propaganda tells us our enemies are monsters, it's a lie that serves war but not truth. When we're taught that people from different countries, cultures, or beliefs are less human than we are, it's never the whole story. The rescued pilots discovered what countless others throughout history have learned. Our common humanity runs deeper than the uniforms we wear, the flags we salute, or the leaders we follow. In the most desperate circumstances, floating in enemy waters, certain of death, these men discovered that compassion can exist even between those taught to hate each other. Their story matters not just as history, but as a lesson for today. In a world still divided by borders, ideologies, and fears, we face the same choice those American sailors did when they spotted enemy pilots in the water. Do we see an enemy, or do we see a human being in need? The answer makes all the difference, not just for those we might help, but for who we become in the process. This story shows us that even in our darkest times, humanity can shine through. The Japanese pilots who expected torture found kindness instead. The Americans who had every reason to hate chose compassion instead. And in that unexpected meeting of supposed enemies, something beautiful happened. The truth of our shared humanity broke through the lies of war. If you found this story powerful, please subscribe to our channel for more true stories that will change how you see the world. Hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that even in our most divided moments, our capacity for compassion can still surprise us. What enemy in your life might actually be a friend you haven't properly met? Comment below with your thoughts.